The storm had been crawling across the plains all afternoon, dragging long curtains of rain behind it like a wounded beast. Elias Crowther had seen storms like this before, angry, relentless, filled with the kind of thunder that shook a man down to his bones. Still, even he didn't expect it to break so suddenly. One moment the sky was a harsh gray wall. The next it tore open with a roar, spilling cold rain over the open land. His horse snorted, agitated, and Elias looked around for shelter before the winds got any worse. That was when he saw it, the old mill, long abandoned, leaning slightly to one side like a tired traveler. But in its upper window, faint as the breath of a dying ember, was the glow of lamplight. It startled him. No one lived out here anymore. No one had for years. Still, a lit lamp meant someone was inside. And someone inside meant at least one thing for him: safety from the storm. He nudged his horse forward. By the time he reached the broken doorway, rain had soaked him clean through. Boots heavy with mud, hat dripping, he paused at the threshold. A stranger might be in there. A desperate person. A dangerous one. So he kept one hand near his holster out of habit. The door creaked under the wind's push, and as it swung open, Elias froze. She was there. Rowena Hale, the giant widow. Almost no one said her name without adding that title, as though her size was more important than her existence. She stood near the far wall, tall enough that her shadow stretched across half the room. Her shoulders brushed the hanging beams, and her long, thick cloak clung wetly to her frame. But her posture wasn't threatening. In fact, she looked small somehow. For a woman known for her strength, she carried herself like someone trying not to break. Her eyes lifted, dark, tired, too wise for her age. "I didn't think anyone else would come here tonight," she said quietly. "Storm changed my plans," Elias answered, removing his hat. "Didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding. The storm's too dangerous. Shut the door before the wind takes it." He obeyed. The mill groaned under the assault of the rain. Loose boards rattled, dust lifted in faint trembling shivers, and the lamplight flickered like a heartbeat, unsure if it wanted to keep beating. Elias brushed the water from his coat and glanced at her again, trying not to stare. Rowena. Hale was not simply tall. She was imposing in a way that made some men feel small. But Elias wasn't afraid of how much space she filled. He was more struck by the loneliness carved into her features, as if she'd been carrying it for years, and in his own chest something faint and familiar stirred. She stepped slightly into the light, and he noticed the way her hands trembled beneath the wet cloak. Not with fear, with exhaustion. "Been caught out long?" he asked gently. "Long enough." She didn't explain more. She looked at him a moment longer, as though gauging whether he was a threat or simply another wandering soul. Then with a slow breath she said, "Elias, may I ask something of you?" He blinked. It surprised him that she knew his name. He had seen her in town on rare occasions, quiet, distant, towering above the market crowds, but they had never really spoken. "Not properly." "You can ask," he said softly. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her cloak. Her throat bobbed with a swallow. For the first time, he saw something raw behind her strong facade, a kind of fear, but not of him, of vulnerability. "It's been so long," she murmured, "since anyone touched me without flinching." Elias felt the air shift, not in a dangerous way, but in a deeply human one. She didn't sound seductive. She sounded broken. "I don't want comfort. I don't want promises," she whispered. "All I want is one kiss, nothing more." There it was, soft, shaking, brave. Elias's breath caught. If another woman had said it, maybe he would have laughed nervously or deflected. But Rowena wasn't like anyone else. She was a widow still wrapped in grief, a woman the world treated like a curiosity, a woman who hadn't been touched or held since her husband died. Because no man wanted to stand close enough to try, he stared at her, the storm crashing outside as though urging him to speak. But words didn't come. Instead, she slowly reached up with trembling fingers and pulled down the heavy edge of her soaked cloak, and he froze, not because of anything improper, because beneath the fabric, above her collarbone and across her shoulder, was a bruise, large, ugly, yellowing at the edges but still painful looking. A bruise that spoke of impact, of hardship, of someone who had been carrying wounds alone for too long. "It still hurts," she whispered. "More than I let people see." He stepped forward without thinking. His voice was low, steady. "Rowena, this isn't about wanting a kiss. You're hurting." She looked startled, then ashamed. "I didn't think anyone would notice." "I do." The words fell out of him before he could stop them. And the moment they did, something cracked open in the silence between them. He gently touched the edge of the bruise. Careful, featherlight. She inhaled sharply, not from the pain but from the shock of being touched with care instead of fear. "You should have told someone," he murmured. "There's no one to tell," she answered, voice breaking. "People stare at me, but they don't see me." Thunder rumbled again, shaking loose dust from the rafters. Elias realized then that she hadn't asked for passion. She had asked for proof that she wasn't fading into the shadows of her own loneliness. But a kiss? No, that wouldn't heal the wound she carried. What she needed was gentleness, presence. He lifted her cloak back up, covering her shoulder again with a slow carefulness that made her eyes glisten. "You ain't invisible, Rowena," he said softly. "Not to me." She closed her eyes, letting his words settle, letting the storm outside fade into a distant roar. Elias stayed close, not touching her again, but letting his presence speak for him. And in the dim glow of the single struggling lamp, two lonely souls stood together, one giant, one wounded, both desperate not for romance, but for the simple aching miracle of being seen. The storm screamed. The mill trembled. But inside, for the first time in years, Rowena Hale didn't feel alone. And neither did he. By the time dawn crept over the plains, the storm had finally grown tired of its own fury. The winds calmed first, then the rain tapered off into a soft mist that clung to the ground like morning breath. Inside the abandoned mill, the world felt strangely still, as if the storm had taken all the noise with it, and left only a fragile peace in its wake. Elias stirred the small fire he'd built during the night, nudging the glowing embers with a stick until they flared into a gentle flame again. The warmth spread slowly, casting a faint glow across the dusty floorboards, the warped walls, and Rowena Hale sitting silently on a crate near the far wall. Her broad shoulders were slouched, but not from exhaustion alone, also from relief. Maybe from the release of saying things she had kept locked away for far too long. He glanced at her. She wasn't watching the fire. She was watching him, not with longing, nor embarrassment, nor regret. Something softer, something searching. "You warm enough over there?" Elias asked quietly, breaking the silence. She nodded, though she still shivered slightly under her half-dry cloak. "I will be. Storms like that don't happen often." She paused. "Or maybe I'm just inside during most of them." He gave her a small smile. "You were in the worst of it last night." "Seems fitting," she said, looking down at her hands. "I'm used to weathering things alone." Elias poured coffee from the blackened tin pot into a cup and walked it over to her. She took it carefully. The cup looked small in her hands and breathed in the steam. "You didn't have to stay," she said again. "Most folks would have left at first light." "I know." He sat on a fallen beam across from her, leaning forward with his own cup cradled in both hands. "But you asked for something last night. Something important." Her breath caught. "I shouldn't have said it." "You should have," he corrected gently. "Maybe not the way you meant it, but the truth behind it needed saying." She stared into her coffee, her shoulders lifting in a slow, uncertain rise. "I felt foolish afterward." "You weren't," he said simply. Her lips pressed together, not quite a smile, but close. Then for a long moment they simply sat there. The fire crackled. The old mill shifted in small creaks as the wood dried from the rain. Outside, the plains glistened under the growing light. Elias studied her quietly. The bruise on her shoulder bothered him more than she realized. Not because he suspected anything violent, her size alone meant few would dare, but because it was the kind of injury someone living alone had to treat alone. No one to help. No one to check on it. No one to notice. Her loneliness echoed his. "I didn't ask for a kiss because I wanted romance," she said suddenly, her voice low. "I asked because I wanted to know if someone could look at me without fear or pity." She swallowed. "Just once." He set his cup down. "Rowena, you don't need a kiss to prove that." "Maybe not," she said. "But when you live the way I do, when people talk more about your height than your name, you start believing you're something to stare at, not someone to hold." She blinked hard. "And when my husband died, I stopped feeling like a woman anyone would ever see again." Elias let her words sink into the quiet. She wasn't fragile, never. But grief had made Her gentle in a way he wasn't used to seeing. A giant of a woman with a heart full of small breaking pieces. "I saw you last night," he said softly. "Not your size. Not your past, you." She inhaled sharply, a sound halfway to a gasp. "Why?" she whispered. "Because I know what it feels like to think no one notices you anymore." Her eyes lifted. "You?" He nodded. "My ranch has been empty a long time. Folks visit less every year. Good men, good neighbors. But they have families. They have homes full of noise." His voice thinned. "Mine's quiet. Too quiet sometimes." She watched him with a dawning understanding that reached deeper than sympathy. "You're lonely." "Yes," he answered, without shame. "But I didn't know how much until last night." Their eyes held across the dim room. The fire popped. The world outside warmed, but inside the mill, a different warmth grew. Slow, steady, unspoken. "Elias?" she asked softly. "Hmm?" "Thank you for touching my shoulder." The words trembled. "No one's touched me in years. Not even a doctor. They always gesture from a distance, or leave things on tables for me to pick up." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "I forgot what gentleness feels like." Elias's throat tightened. "You deserve gentleness. More than you know." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he stood slowly and offered her his hand, not for a kiss, not for closeness, but simply to help her stand. She hesitated, then placed her huge, calloused hand in his. Her palm engulfed his fingers, her grip firm but cautious, as though afraid she might accidentally break something fragile. He guided her to her feet. She winced slightly as her shoulder shifted. "That bruise is healing," he murmured, "but it needs real tending. Let me bring salve for it tomorrow." She looked stunned. "You'd come back?" "I said I would," he answered, meeting her gaze. "And I will." Something in her chest seemed to loosen, like a knot that had been tied for years finally giving way. She exhaled a shaky breath. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything." They walked outside together, the ground soft beneath their boots, the sun still climbing. Her wagon sat where she'd left it, water dripping from its wooden edges. Elias lifted the reins onto the seat for her, then stepped aside. "You ride careful," he said. She fiddled with the reins, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is more than I asked for." "Sometimes," he said, "we get more than we think we deserve." She looked at him, then really looked, and something warm and fragile flickered across her expression. Not desire, not longing, hope. Slowly she reached out and cupped his cheek with her large hand, her thumb brushing his skin as lightly as dust in sunlight. "No kiss," she murmured. "But thank you for seeing me." He covered her hand with his, squeezing once. "Always." She straightened her back, gathered the reins, and drove off down the shimmering road. He watched until her wagon became a distant shape upon the wet horizon. The morning felt different, so did he. For the first time in a long while, Elias Crowther wasn't just waiting for days to pass. He was waiting for tomorrow,